I see some of a couple of my current students in the audience who are in my current responsible conduct of research class. This will be, you know, a repeat for a couple of them, but that's fine. That means that they're going to do all the better by the end of the class. So I wanted to talk to you all today about some historical reflections on the history of human subject research. As requested by Jane. I was shocked and was like, oh, people want to learn more about this? Well, good. I have plenty to tell them. My objectives for this talk, if now this doesn't want to work for me anymore, and that's fine. This doesn't want to work either. Technical, there we go. Don't do that. All right. I want to talk about the history of human subject research ethics within the larger transformation of the practice of medicine over the 19th and 20th centuries. And to do so, I want to contextualize this history within the conceptual revolution that took place during the 19th century, that for the first time conceives of what it means to be human as a purely biological being, rather than a spiritual being or a rational being. As how humans had been conceived before that. And it seems commonplace to us now to just think of ourselves as biological. So commonplace that we don't even think that there could have been a time when we didn't imagine ourselves as biological beings. And this transformation in how we think about what it means to be human had tremendous effects in terms of the explosion of new techniques and treatments within allopathic medicine for how to treat illness and disease, but it also had some hidden effects in terms of sort of reducing us to our biology and what that does when we reduce our existence strictly to biology. So I want to try to incorporate a little bit of all that into how we understand the history of human subject research and its ethics. All right, so to do so, I'm going to broaden one of the hypotheses of Michel Foucault. And Foucault investigates the 19th century, where the point of the 19th century, where man first becomes an object of study. And I put man in quotes there because it's important to realize that for this talk, man is not humanity itself. Man is a specific cultural conception of what it means to be human. And I want to make that distinct. You know, we always talk about man and humanity as indistinct from each other, but I want to really emphasize that that is a Western cultural conception of what it means to be human, and I'll get more into that in a minute. So within this transformation, our biology takes special significance, as for the first time, we get defined purely as a biological being. And therefore, the production of biological knowledge and the ideas of laws of biology for the first time become thinkable. What does it mean? Like before we thought of man as a biological being, we thought of ourselves as being animated by spirits. And you couldn't think that we could have knowledge of the divine being's will in terms of our manifestation, right? That was something that was seen to be beyond our comprehension. But once we begin to think of what it means to be human in biological terms, then we can begin thinking that, hey, there are laws of biology, we can learn those laws of biology and understand those laws of biology. And therefore we can actually make interventions that have impact on our biological function. Good things. So Foucault talks about the birth of the clinic. And in this, in his canonical text, when he talks about the birth of the clinic, he talks about how doctors, for the first time, were able to gain an exclusive knowledge of anatomical and biological function through dissection and microscopic examination, gazing into the open body, which allowed them to differentiate normal bodies from pathological bodies. This knowledge of biological function allowed doctors to match internal pathology to external signs and symptoms of disease. And that's very important in terms of clinical examinations, being able to match those outer signs and symptoms and understanding the internal pathology behind this, right? And by doing so, doctors were able to gain a cultural authority by defining the clinic as their scientific laboratory where biomedical knowledge is produced under their exclusive expertise. So then he talks about this thing called the clinical gaze, which is a phrase I hope many of you have heard before. But basically, what he means by that is that these new epistemological, ontological, and technical reshapings of medical perception led to a new way of perceiving, a new kind of perception when we look at the human body. And it's being able to look at the human body, but thinking on the molecular level about what is taking place within those bodies. And this is part of the process of reducing what it means to be human to our biological processes. So, important for this talk, and I know this is sort of a long sort of workaround to what we're getting at, but the clinical gaze necessitated new objects of study to look inside, to be explored, to be opened up and experimented upon to understand the biological laws that dictate how they work. So scholars have traditionally, scholars in the history of medicine have traditionally pointed to the clinical gaze as sort of the source of what has long been critiqued as the impersonal and detached nature of the contemporary doctor-patient relationship. And so much of our contemporary medical education has been so aimed at trying to reverse this trend, right? Of that detached nature that we see in the clinic. So, bodies for research. Basically, until the enactment of new federal regulations at the end of the 1970s, throughout the history of both anatomical research and form and biological research and function, the vast majority of the subjects that were chosen for experimentation and exploration were persons who were confined or institutionalized, people in prisons, in asylums, in orphanages, in mental hospitals, and sometimes those held as slaves. And these institutionalized populations were chosen specifically for their outcast status. And the majority of them throughout this history were prisoners. The vast majority were almost always prisoners. The roots actually stretch back to antiquity. Now, at this point, people weren't looking in bodies studying biological function because they didn't have the same kind of theory about biology, and they didn't think of humans as biological beings. But they were looking into humans to understand anatomical form. And back in antiquity, we had Herophilus, Chalcedon, and also Erasistratus of Chios. I always practice saying that, and it still doesn't roll off the tongue. But they were given permission to cut into a living criminal who was condemned to death, but before he died, they were given permission to cut into him and look inside to study his anatomy. Animal dissection had been used and was a long established practice, championed ardently by Aristotle over half a century earlier, and they felt that the animal anatomical form was a good stand-in for human anatomical form. But there were strong, very strong taboos against actually mutilating the human body and cutting them open, both before death and even after death. When we get to the classic era of anatomical research in the time of Andreas Vesalius, then we really see an explosion in new researches into human anatomical form. And almost all of them were exclusively executed prisoners that were selected for this. The bodies were given to doctors and surgeons by the state as part of their punishment. And it was because of their moral transgressions that such bodies were deemed to no longer be deserving of the honor and dignity of not being violated in such a way. One of the, when we think of Vesalius, we always think of the muscle prints and the muscle men But one of the little known facts about Vesalius that I like to point out is, in the text part, and it's all in Latin, so hardly nobody ever pays attention to the text, right? You just open the book and look at the pictures. But in the text part, they always have these block letters that, preface the opening paragraph. And in many of these, there are little cartoons of little cherubs actually making fun of their procurement of bodies. And in this one, you can see they're actually taking an executed prisoner off of the scaffolding that was used for that prisoner's execution. And of course, it wasn't just a private thing that took place in the clinic, right? The executions and the subsequent dismemberment and cutting open of the body was huge public theater during the time. And this is when the study of anatomy actually blossomed, where thousands of people flocked to amphitheaters to watch human dissections being done live. And to cut open a person after death, it was seen as the most egregious form of disrespect and punishment that you could do for a person. And these demonstrations offered a kind of macabre combination of curiosity, sex, and crime and punishment. And as I said, the subjects were all executed prisoners. Transferring into the 17th century, there were a number of early blood transfusions that took place after Harvey's work. One of the most famous ones, if you ever read the transactions of the Royal Society of London, you will see that there were many, many, many blood transfusion experiments. And this was during a time, this was during the immoral theory of medicine, where we felt that a lot of the ills from which people suffered were caused either by an imbalance of their humors. So early blood transfusion experiments were aimed at seeing if they could transfer the humors of one kind of being into someone who was seen as ill or defective. Researchers tried to treat madness by transfusing the blood of a docile animal into the madman, believing that his madness was caused by the excessive heat of his blood. And they did hundreds of these experiments over and over again. In the 18th century and the 19th century, we saw growing demand from medical schools and universities for their clinical material for dissection and anatomy classes. Britain passed the Murder Act in 1751, which actually stipulated or forbid actually the burial of executed prisoners and mandated that they be sent to be dissected in public. They followed up with the Anatomy Act in 1832 that broadened the category of folks who could be legitimately sent off to be dissected and dismembered. And we had similar laws in the United States as well. In the 19th century, we see an explosion in terms of the use of Blacks in the American South for this very purpose. Black bodies in particular, both alive and dead, were used extensively for experimentation and education throughout the 19th century in almost all medical schools in the country. Medical schools actually competed for students by advertising in local newspapers their access to clinical material, saying how many bodies that they had for their anatomy classes. The dissecting tables and operating amphitheaters and classroom demonstrations and the laboratories were filled with Black bodies in sort of a revolving door. There was particularly huge demand for Black cadavers, usually executed prisoners, more so in the South than almost any place else. And they were granted by the state, or either there was a lot of grave robbing that took place, directed by medical schools as well. And if you look through the archives of a lot of medical institutions, you'll see hundreds of photographs like this that took place over the years. So it became a rite of passage for students during their anatomy class to at some point take a stage picture with their cadaver. And these had a sort of culture to them in terms of how they were arranged. Always present at some point was a skeleton, either off to the side or, as in this picture, sort of part of the crew. And in these pictures, you can also tell the race of the cadaver often that was being dissected. This figure down here is a porter, who were often Black, and porters were hired to clean up after each dissection. Sometimes, in a lot of them, you'll see a chalkboard that has all kinds of little epithets that are supposed to be witty and funny. Rest in pieces, a martyr to science. He lived for others and died for us. That's probably one of the most common phrases that you see in a lot of these pictures. And like I said, there are hundreds of them. They were made into postcards, and medical students sent these postcards to their families as sort of a memento of how they were doing in medical school. But now we come to the classic era of experimentation in the 20th century. And I break it down into an early phase, which is pre-World War II, where we had dozens of less formalized research studies that were conducted, usually investigating the causes of infectious diseases, particularly those that were affecting colonial commerce. The emphasis the subjects were nearly all US prisoners, and also the prisoners held in US colonies. A lot of people don't think of the US as a colony holding country, but Puerto Rico, the Philippines, these were all US colonies during the time. And so one of the earliest ones that we have good record for is a 1906 bubonic plague and cholera study that took place in the Philippines, in Manila. Here, the inmates were paid in cigarettes and cigars to let researchers purposefully infect them with the plague, and the subjects were not told the nature or the severity of the experiments. From the records that survived, we know that there were at least 18 deaths, but there was also paralysis, mental disorders, and heart damage. And I'm going to take you through sort of a few of these, but it's basically, this is just the tip of the iceberg. A lot of the records are incomplete and that we don't have for, but they're what I'm only able to present to you sort of a fraction of the overall what took place. At the same time, also in the Philippines, the US acquired the Philippines from the Spanish as a result of the Spanish-American War. And almost immediately, there was a cadre of, well, there was a regional government that was set up, and with the regional government came missionaries and also came doctors to do experiments. So there was also a Beriberi study that took place around the same time. This one was conducted by Dr. Richard Strong, where he withheld proper nutrition from almost 30 prisoners in order to create the thiamine deficiency that was causing the disease. And of course, the participants experienced all kinds of associated sequelae of symptoms that went along with their nutritional deficiency. Here at home in the state, there were a number of experiments that took place in the Mississippi prison state system. Even the numbers for today's prisons, if we think they're skewed in terms of their racial bias, it was exactly the same in the early part of the 19th century. In the late part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century. Prisons throughout the South were approximately 50 to 60% African American. And so the prison studies that took place were primarily on African American prisoners. In this particular study, the researchers were trying to discern the cause of pellagra, and it was originally thought to be an infectious disease, and only later did they learn that it was caused by a niacin deficiency. And again, there was a lot of malnourishment that resulted in severe dermatitis, diarrhea, and dementia. The subjects, as I said, were mostly Black. They were promised early parole. And this is another this set up a kind of template for how prison research was done. They were either paid in items like cigarettes that were expensive and hard to get when you're a prisoner, or they were promised early parole, or some combination of both. And they suffered skin eruptions, gastrointestinal sickness, nervous disturbances, etc. Out in California, there was a testicular transplant experiment that also took place during the early 20th century. Here, Dr. Leo Stanley was trying to figure out a cure for senility. And it was hypothesized that senility was actually caused by a decrease in our sexual hormones as we age. And so he hypothesized that possibly extracting the testes from something like a goat who was thought to be extremely amorous, let's say, and putting those testes into an older prisoner might actually cause a cure for their senility. The extracted testes were either inserted into the prisoner's scrotum or into the abdominal wall. And he was undeterred by early negative results that killed some of his subjects. And the study was allowed to continue for 4 years before they finally stopped it. It's also important, I want to point out that for most of the medical professionals that I'm discussing, their motives for conducting these studies were usually good, that they were trying to do something helpful, they were trying to figure out cures for disease, and they thought that prisoners were a good category of people to use as a way to help them repay their debts to society. But every once in a while, we find researchers who had other darker motives. And one was Cornelius Rhodes, who was a pathologist from the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research in New York. And he used prisoners in Puerto Rico, which is another US colony, to test whether cancer could be spread through direct injection of malignant cells from a cancerous patient into a healthy one. He purposefully hid details of the experiment from the subject, so there was no informed consent, and at least 13 of the subjects died from his study. We have documentary evidence that kind of gives us a window into his motivation. And in a letter to another doctor leaked to the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party, Rhodes wrote, "The Puerto Ricans are beyond doubt the dirtiest, laziest, most degenerate, and thievish race of men ever inhabiting this sphere. It makes you sick to inhabit the same island with them. What the island needs is not public health work, but a tidal wave or something to totally exterminate the population. It might then be livable. I've done my best to further the process of extermination by killing off 8 and transplanting cancer into several more. The latter has not resulted in any fatality so far. The matter of consideration for the patient's welfare plays no role here. In fact, all physicians take delight in the abuse and torture of the unfortunate subjects." So, as a reward for his efforts in the US colony, Dr. Rhodes got a promotion, and he was allowed to return to New York and continue his job at the Rockefeller Institute, but then shortly after was hired as vice president for the New York Academy of Medicine. And during World War II, he rejoined the military, where he was promoted to colonel and chief medical officer of the Chemical Warfare Division. You can see where this is going, where he helped establish chemical weapons laboratories for the military. He oversaw the testing of poison gas on over 60,000 unwitting US service members. Many of them were Puerto Ricans, and the subjects, of course, suffered the horrific effects of poison gas agents. And for this work, he was awarded the Legion of Merit in 1945. And then he was promoted again. He was named the director of Sloan Kettering Institute after World War II, where he conducted chemotherapy and radiation experiments on human subjects for the US Department of Energy. And so this leads us transition to sort of a larger era of US radiation experiments that took place in about a 35-year period between the mid-1930s and the early 1970s. These experiments included removing bodies from graveyards to test them for radiation. It also included irradiating the heads of children as a treatment for hookworm. There's a very good documentary on this. It's called Hole in the Head, if anybody ever wants to try to check it out. But I highly recommend it. I mean, it's horrifying, but I highly recommend it. It also included exposing soldiers and prisoners to high levels of radiation, and then irradiating the testes of prisoners to see if it would cause birth defects, and then finally giving lethal doses of radiation to cancer patients under the guise of treatment. As far as the cancer patients go with radiation experiments, most were selected from US public hospitals, most prominently at UC San Francisco, Berkeley, Iowa, Massachusetts, University of Texas Medical Branch, and Cincinnati General Hospital. Those are the ones we had the best record from. These hospitals had a secret contract with the military that was not disclosed to the communities in which they were situated, nor to the patients who were enrolled as subjects. They selected poor, often Black charity patients. Not all of them were terminally ill when they were selected to be subjects for these experiments. And most were irradiated during an early stage of their cancer in a dose that was known to be lethal and not known to be at all efficacious. And of course, they were being told that they were being treated for their cancer, not that they were being used for an experiment. Some subjects were given total body radiation in one massive dose to simulate a soldier's exposure to a nuclear warhead going off near them. And this military level of radiation had no chance of improving their health, and they knew this when it was administered. There were thousands of participants in all, and the exact numbers are unknown, but we do know that there were multiple thousands, and this is part of a 1994 congressional commission that looked into the US radiation experiments. It's published now, it's online, you can see all of this for yourself. And of course, these patients suffered all the acute signs of radiation sickness and the intense pain from burns on their bodies. And it is estimated that 25% of those who were enrolled in these studies died within 1 month as a result of their radiation exposure, and most of them died within a year. And again, they were not told that they were being used as experimental material. They were only told that they were being treated for their cancer. Also during World War II, we had, a lot of people know about the US Public Health Service syphilis study in Tuskegee, but there was also a sister study that took place in Guatemala during the same period. In Tuskegee, the subjects were not purposefully infected with syphilis. They selected subjects that they knew had it and then refused treatment and didn't tell them that they actually had it. But here, they didn't hold back so much. They actually infected 1,700 Guatemalan prisoners and mental institution patients with syphilis and other STDs in order to test the efficacy of penicillin as a treatment. They hired prostitutes and either made sure that they already had a syphilis infection or infected them purposefully and forced them to have sex with the prisoners and the patients in the mental institution. And if a syphilitic infection did not occur naturally, they took both the prostitutes and the men that they were forcing them to have sex with, made abrasions on their genitalia, and then forced them to have sex again. And if that still didn't work, then the men were given syphilis by spinal injection. This was conducted during the period 1946 through 1948, and it was conducted by many of the same personnel who were also involved as lead investigators on the Tuskegee syphilis study. It was co-sponsored by the US Public Health Service, also the NIH, in its nascent form. The Pan American Health Sanitary Bureau, now the Pan American Health Organization, and the Guatemalan government. The study ended in 1948 when they had finally figured out definitively that penicillin was a good curative agent for syphilis. However, they left the majority of the people that they had infected untreated once they had figured this out. And we know that at least 83 subjects died to unspecified complications of the disease, but it could be a lot more because they stopped following up once they left. So there was no long-term follow-up. These were just the people who died within that 2-year phase when the study was ongoing. And as I said, the same PIs who worked on the Guatemalan study and who knew, this is important, who knew that penicillin was an effective cure for syphilis were the same who also insisted that the men in Tuskegee, Alabama could not receive treatment for their syphilis infections. Switching gears a little bit, also during World War II, and as an effort to help the war, there was a large, huge malaria study that took place in Stateville prison, not far outside of Chicago, where their doctors infected 441 prisoners with malaria to test possible cures. The inmates were only told that they were helping the war effort and they were promised early parole, but they were not actually being told that they were being given malaria. In addition to suffering from the disease, they also suffered from the toxic effects of the experimental drugs being used to treat it. And one researcher, in a moment of honesty, observed to the British Medical Journal, he said, criminals in our penitentiaries are fine experimental material and much cheaper than chimpanzees. And you see this logic over and over again, right? That sort of here we have a captive population, easy to follow up on, easy to make sure they make their clinical appointments from a medical perspective without critical reflection on sort of the power dynamic at play there. Prisoners seem like an ideal population upon which to experiment upon. So, at the same time, which became public after World War II, that we figured out that there were a number of German doctors during the National Socialist period that were performing a number of human subject studies. They were doing hypothermia studies. These were also using prisoners. High altitude studies, experiments on the best forms of sterilization, studies simulating war injuries, including mustard gas exposure, vaccination trials, and these were all prisoners of war. And of course, what we did after World War II is we put them on trial. And this became what is known as the Nuremberg Tribunal. We put a group of 24 on trial for war crimes and crimes against humanity, and of particular concern were the human experimentation conducted by the Nazi doctors. And as a result, we got the International Directives for Human Experimentation, or the Nuremberg Code. First and foremost in the Nuremberg Code is that the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. This means that the person involved should have legal capacity to give consent, should be so situated as to be able to exercise free power of choice, which would automatically exclude prisoners, without the intervention of any element of force, fraud, deceit, duress, overreaching, or other ulterior form of constraint or coercion, and should have sufficient knowledge and comprehension of the elements of the subject matter involved as to enable him to make an understanding and enlightened decision. So that there's voluntary and informed consent are the very first principles that emerged out of the Nuremberg Code. They also said that the experiment should be conducted as to avoid all unnecessary physical injury and suffering. No experiment should be conducted where there is an automatic reason to believe that death or disability will occur. The experiment should be conducted only by scientifically qualified persons, and that during the course of the experiment, all subjects that have the liberty to say stop. Now, the German doctors cited US research practices and those in other European countries in their defense and said, hey, look, we're not doing anything different than the rest of you all are doing, as I cited in numerous examples before talking about them. But despite presenting evidence of similar American research, 7 Nazi doctors were sentenced to death by hanging and the others to very long prison terms. And this is the important point for us, that in the aftermath of the Nuremberg Code and the sentencing of these doctors in Germany, that the egregious US practices on prisoners actually expanded post-World War II and increased. Why do you think that happened? One of the early champions against implementing the Nuremberg Code was a doctor at Mass General Hospital at Harvard University, Henry Knowles Beecher. He was chief of anesthesia at MGH about a 40-year period between the 30s and the 60s. He also did groundbreaking research on the use of placebo effect in medical trials. And so the reason that we have double-blind studies nowadays is all thanks to his work on placebo. He led Harvard University's fight against full implementation of the Nuremberg Code. And he did so thinking that the integrity and character of the medical profession in the US was actually adequate to make full implementation of the Nuremberg Code's requirement for informed voluntary consent and unnecessary constraint on research and researchers. He thus led the fight against the US implementing the informed consent portion of the Nuremberg Code, and he was joined by a number of researchers in various other universities who all felt that this was unnecessary. In essence, he famously said the Nuremberg Code was written for Nazis. We're not Nazis. We're just good people. When I talk about this next study, it's probably the one that it definitely makes me most squeamish, but it's probably the one that's most disturbing to a lot of my students as well. And this was a hepatitis study conducted at Willowbrook State Hospital in the mid-1950s through the early 1970s. There, Dr. Saul Krugman fed fecal matter to mentally disabled children in order to try to test to see if that was a vector for spreading hepatitis virus throughout the facility. He mixed fecal matter with the children's chocolate milk and fed it to them for 15 years. He began gingerly with a solution of 1 part fecal matter to 100,000 part chocolate milk, but bravely worked his way up to a 1 in 5 dilution. And at that point, we have to wonder, like, was there really any chocolate in there at all? He claimed the conditions were so filthy already at the school that the children would catch hepatitis anyway. And therefore, why not try to figure out how it was being spread, exactly how it was being spread. Also during this time, the 50s through the 70s, was a time when Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia became the premier institution for dermatology training in the United States. Still, UPenn, their dermatology program is still recognized as one of the top in the nation, but it was during this period when they really became the top. This is Holmesburg Prison in its degenerated state nowadays, but before it was abandoned, it was one of the major places for prison experimentation during this era. And it became the training ground, the premier training ground for both medical students and residents in dermatology. By the late 1960s, it was the largest and best known in the country. And they did expansive phase 1 testing of both pharmaceutical and commercial products. So how many of you put on deodorant today? I hope that's everybody. I want to see more hands than that. Your shampoo products, your deodorant products, all of those products, their formulas, most of them can be traced back to the research that was done at this facility on prisoners. And that may seem pretty innocuous, but they went beyond just testing, nice little lotions and whatnot, and perfumes. They also tested radioactive isotopes, dioxin, hallucinogenic incapacitants, in contracts with the Department of Defense and various other chemical warfare and cancer studies. Kligman was recruited to Holmesburg due to recurring athlete's foot outbreaks. And he famously, well, I'll get to that say, he conducted prior research infecting mentally disabled children with ringworm. But he famously remarked that upon his first visit to Holmesburg prison, he said that all I saw before me were acres of skin. An anthropoid colony, mainly healthy, under perfect control conditions, like a farmer seeing a fertile field for the first time. But he made UPenn the National Center for Dermatology Studies and Education for decades to come. As part of the US radiation experiments during the early 1960s, also through 1970s, you'll notice that a lot of these end at 1971. I don't know if you guys have picked up on that, but that's when we got a lot of whistleblowing, and all of a sudden the cat was out of the bag that we were doing these horrific Nazi-esque things to prisoners all across the country. But in Oregon State Prison, endocrinologist Carl Heller conducted a study on over 100 prisoners there, irradiating their testes. He was paid $1.2 million by the U.S. Atomic Agency, or the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, to research the effects of radiation on male reproductive function. He performed his experiments irradiating the testes of his subjects and checking their function. Afterwards, he developed a little contraption where he'd have the men lay on a table, and there was a hole cut out, similar to if you're laying on a massage table, they cut a hole out for your face. Instead of your face, they cut a hole out around your testes, and they descended into a little cup of warm water to make sure that they descended down as far as possible. And then he had his radiation arm directed at the descended testes. They were paid $5 per month and $25 per testicular tissue biopsy and compensation for their participation. And then also in a eugenic twist, they received an extra $100 at the end of the study if they agreed to submit to a vasectomy. And finally, in this period, before we get reform, I want to talk about Austin Stough and his drug plasma experience. He began his career as a part-time physician at Oklahoma State Penitentiary in 1939, but he started a business extracting blood from the prisoners there to meet the growing demand of plasma after World War II. A lot of our use of plasma starts around World War II, and it was but and after World War II, there was a shortage. Because during the war, we were extracting plasma from a lot of soldiers. But once we no longer had such a large military force, then there was a huge supply issue. In selling blood products, he also realized that there was a market for drug testing. So he expanded partnerships to include both the Arkansas State Prison System and the Alabama State Prison Systems. And he enrolled thousands of inmates in phase 2 drug studies, paying them $1 a day for their participation. In all, he conducted over 130 drug trials for 37 different drug companies over this period of time. He, in addition to the drug studies, he also extracted their blood and their plasma and sold it on the open market. He was making nearly $1 million a year from selling their blood products and the contracts that he had with the various pharmaceutical companies, which, I mean, is still a huge net. I would love to make $1 million a year. But then it was astronomical if you make that much money. And this is important, that by 1969, it was estimated that his research accounted for between 25% and 50% of all phase 2 drug testing in the US. All phase 2 drug testing in the US. Of course, hepatitis epidemics broke out in the prisons where he was doing this due to conditions of gross contamination. Many prisoners died slowly in a very painful fashion, but the exact numbers were concealed because he left that out of his records. And the money that was generated from these experiments continues today. The Stough Group, Stough Enterprises Incorporated, still owns a lot of plasma centers around the US, and they've also divested their earnings into historic building renovation. So all the money that they made off the backs of prisoners is still in effect, and still enhancing the wealth of their family and their descendants, and now their stockholders. So we get to the period of reform in the civil rights era. And it was kicked off, if you'll recall, our friend Henry Knowles Beecher finally has a come to Jesus understanding about what's going on with human experimentation in the US. And he writes a groundbreaking article for the New England Journal of Medicine called Ethics in Clinical Research, where he documents a lot of the unethical practices that he was able to uncover. Interestingly enough, JAMA rejected this article, didn't want to hear about it. We had Austin Stough's research was exposed in 1969. The radiation experiments were made public in 71, and the details of the US Public Health Service syphilis study at Tuskegee were also made more public in 1971. Now, the researchers who were doing the Tuskegee experiment, they were publishing their results all along. It's not like this was a top secret thing. It just wasn't in the popular press. And that's the case with a lot of these researchers. You know, they were publishing in medical journals. The entire medical community knew what kind of research was going on, but it wasn't being made widely available to the public. And after that, we had the congressional creation of the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects, which led to the writing of the Code of Federal Regulations in 1974 that now sort of guides all institutional IRB actions. And it led to the Federalized Ethical Principles and Applications called the Belmont Report that was published in 1979. And those, you know, that document remains the basis for the Code of Federal Regulations and all the constrictions now around human subject research. However, that did not end the spate of controversies. And I'll talk about a few more that have contemporary examples where we still see that there are huge ethical challenges for how we conduct human subject research. So one is in the AIDS clinical trials that took place in 1994, studying ZBD or AZT treatment. ZBD became the standard of care after the study was completed. But in subsequent research was funded by the US Centers for Disease Control and NIH, continued placebo-controlled trials in poor countries. And that was, in essence, the huge dilemma here, is whether or not there were other standard of care agents that were able to be tested against ZBD. But in both Thailand and in African countries where ZBD was being tested, they did not offer standard of care. They only offered placebo. The patients in the trials in the US had unrestricted access to the drug, or this is after the trial, while those in the poor countries did not. So and after we developed what we think is a new good therapy, the people who sacrificed in actual to develop that therapy didn't have access to the drug afterwards. The good ethical practice is compare standard of care to the experimental treatment, plus standard of care, not to placebo, right? And so responding to criticism, the PIs changed the study design in Thailand, but they didn't do so in Africa. They continued to only test against placebo. And with the argument that standard of care there was practically nil, and so therefore they were doing standard of care comparison. Many of you probably have heard about the Jesse Gelsinger case, who was one of the first to receive a gene transplant therapy. In his case, the investigators failed to disclose their financial interest in the company that developed the therapy. This is still a huge issue today with licensing agreements between researchers, universities, and private industry. The family was also not told all the risks that the therapy had proved fatal in primate trials and had not been told about other adverse events. So one of the stipulations in terms of starting human subject research is that we have to believe that based on your animal trials, that there's a likelihood of benefit. And so if at the animal trial phase that we see that there's high adverse effects and high incidences of death, that should be an automatic indication that it's not ready for human trials. Another case was artificial heart transplant of James Quinn, who died of a stroke in 2002, 9 months after receiving his artificial heart transplant. He was a perfect example of the therapeutic misconception, where an experimental procedure of the highest risk with little to no chance of patient benefit is conducted. However, the patient is not aware that there's little to no chance of therapeutic benefit, right? And that's not clearly disclosed by the researchers. The patient believes by participating in experimental treatment that they're getting treatment that has a likelihood of benefit. His widow sued the manufacturer and the hospital for their negligence and fraud, saying that her husband was not well informed about the ordeal he would face. But Drexel College of Medicine, who had performed the experiment, they maintained their innocence even after the trial, saying that we donated thousands of hours to Mr. Quinn's care, and we did so with pride. And it's no doubt that they did, but that doesn't negate the fact that what was going on was a trial that it was not clear if there was going to be therapeutic results. Finally, a huge lead abatement study that took place in the 1990s through the year 2000, which was attempting to find more effective measures to remove lead paint from old housing stock. A nonprofit organization contracted with a private company to neutralize lead paint in these homes rather than remove them. And then thousands of families were allowed to move into these homes, but not told that there was an experimental lead abatement procedure that had taken place. They were told that the houses were lead free. They were paid to move into these houses that once had dangerously high lead content, but that underwent the new treatment. Over a dozen children developed permanent cognitive and behavioral disabilities because of their lead exposure. And the children in the study displayed the consistent developmental issues that we know come from lead poisoning. So the point I really want to leave you all with is that the good intentions of researchers, often without critical historical reflection, lead to a utilitarian approach to conducting research. And by this, the utilitarian approach means that a risk to a few others becomes worth a benefit to the rest of us. And that's what we really have to guard against. Some contemporary challenges: there are political, career, economic, and social interests that continue to pose inextricable conflicts of interest that undermine protection and respect for research subjects. Universities are trying to catch up with this and trying to have more and more thorough conflict of interest disclosures and trying to manage those conflicts of interest, but we're playing catch up. The widespread collecting of genetic information that cannot be completely de-identified and that is being biobanked, I think, is another huge area where I think we're trying to play catch up, that we got so excited about collecting genetic material and we can't really fully inform those who are volunteering their genetic material about how that material is going to be used in the future. There is also huge federal and state disinvestment from educational research, pushing more and more investigators to the private sector, which has a fiduciary responsibility to investors and stockholders, not to patients. So all of these, I think, are continuing challenges that we have to face. But I thank you all for sitting through this, and for the 1 or 2 minutes we have left, I can entertain any questions. Some of my sources.